All right, we are in Matthew chapter 5, and we are continue to work our way through the Sermon on the Mount. It was suggested that since we'd already done the Beatitudes, that we just continue working our way through the Sermon on the Mount a little at a time, and so that's what we're doing. Just really quickly, I'll just remind you of what we have said to establish a little bit of context to what we're talking about. First of all, the context is established at the end of Matthew chapter 4. Jesus was preaching the gospel of the kingdom. And that's really important because there are some things that are taught in the Sermon on the Mount that some people want to assign to Old Testament. Because this was before the cross, they'll say, well, that's teaching that was done away with. And but it's important to remember that Jesus is preaching the gospel of the kingdom. So that's an important broad picture context to remember. And that's particularly important with regards to some of the topics that we're going to talk about tonight. The second thing I would say about the context is the simple structure that I use to outline the Sermon on the Mount. Now, there's 100 million different outlines, and there's absolutely nothing special about mine. But I'll just really quickly remind you, and it's easy for me to remember because the words all start with C. So starting with the Beatitudes, Matthew 5, verse 3, down through Matthew 5, verse 19, Jesus is talking about character. This is the character of a kingdom citizen. And then he shows what that character looks like, starting in Matthew 5, verse 20, with a series of contrasts. Unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And so there's this contrast. You've heard that it was said, but I say to you. And so down through the rest of Matthew chapter 5, Jesus is teaching by contrast. Starting in chapter 6, verse 1, he's just talking about conduct. Now, again, it's not to say that he's not talking about conduct anywhere else, but rather than using contrast, he's just prescribing conduct. This is how you do alms. This is how you pray. This is where your priorities are. We'll talk more about that as we go along. And that is the largest section of the sermon that goes all the way down through chapter 7 and verse 12. So chapter 6 down through chapter 7, verse 12 is conduct. And then starting in verse 13, when Jesus says, enter through the narrow gate, the rest of the sermon from Matthew 7:13 down through the end, Jesus is issuing a call for response. He's saying, this is how you respond. This is what I'm expecting your response to be, or hoping it will be, to the preaching, the sermon that I've delivered. And so those are my four key words: character, contrast, conduct, and call. Now, that's my nickel tour of the Sermon on the Mount. So where we are right now is we are in the contrast section of the sermon. Tonight, we're going to pick up in Matthew 5 and verse 27. Last week, we talked about this business of the righteousness. What's that? Oh, I thought Laura said something to me. The righteousness that exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees. And we talked illustrating that with verses 21 to 26 on this business of murder versus the content of heart. Now, Jesus is not setting out here to merely reform the law of Moses or restore the law of Moses. But there is a sense in which Jesus is saying we need to get back to the heart and remember what's going on from which these laws spring. And so it's not just about murder. It's not just about the outward act, perhaps the most extreme manifestation of one's hatred toward another. but those who would harbor in their heart, who would call another fool or good for nothing, who would mistreat someone in other ways. Jesus said that's important enough that you need to deal with that too. That's just as much a violation of law. That makes you just as guilty, and you need to deal with that. It's not just about the physical behavior of murder, which certainly would be condemned, but it's also about the heart that's behind that. And so, in some ways, Matthew chapter 5, 21 to 26 show us a pattern that Jesus is going to follow in his teaching down through the end of Matthew chapter 5. You have heard that it was said, but I say to you. Here's the physical that everybody accepts, that everybody understands. But Jesus is saying there's something greater at play in each of these as well. So I'm going to take a breath for just a moment and ask, are there any questions about context, the overall flow of thought in the sermon, or about anything down through Matthew 5:26? Okay. Well, let's just look at the next section, the next paragraph, if you will, of the sermon, and then we will talk about it a little bit. Tom, would you be willing to read for me tonight?
Sure.
Will you read Matthew 5:27 through 30, please, sir?
27 through 30. Ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, Thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say unto you, that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her, hath committed adultery with her already in his heart. And if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out, and cast it from thee. For it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that the whole body should be cast into hell. And if thy right hand offend thee, cut it off, and cast it from thee. For it is profitable for thee that one of the members should perish, and not that the whole body should be cast into hell.
Okay. So what is the physical sin? What's the kind of the big sin that you kind of go, yeah, of course that's sin? What's he addressing here? Adultery. He starts with adultery. All right. I'm going to take just a moment to talk about adultery, because it's not only relevant to this immediate paragraph, but the next one that comes up. But we need to make sure that we understand what the word adultery means. It often gets confused and used interchangeably with the word fornication, but they are not the same. Adultery is a form of fornication, but not all fornication is adultery. And so we need to make sure that we understand what that word means. What is adultery?
Or one of the parties is married, if not both.
Okay, that's the generally accepted idea. I think, however, that as the Bible uses the word adultery, it actually is further than that. And that is that it involves at least one party, whether or not they're married, they are bound.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's a significant difference, because the Bible describes a person who is unmarried and unbound, who is married but not bound, who is married and bound, and who is unmarried and bound. And so marriage and bond, or being bound, are not synonymous in the scriptures. They're related, but not synonymous. And so adultery here, adultery is a matter of violating bond. That's important. And so you don't violate bond. You do not commit adultery. But Jesus is, as in the case of murder in the preceding paragraph, Jesus is concerned with more than just the physical act. And so what does he address in this context?
Your thoughts, I guess you could say.
That's exactly right. He addresses the matter of the heart. He addresses the way that we think. Lust is just as significant as adultery. Now, that doesn't mean that it's the same sin or that it has the same consequences. And when I say consequences, I don't mean spiritual consequences. All sin separates us from God. I think that's the level on which Jesus is equating things here. Lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh. Lust is not the same as adultery. Okay. Adultery is a very specific sin, but Jesus is saying that we have to begin with not just regulating our physical activity, but if we're going to regulate our physical activity, we have to regulate our hearts. We have to control our thoughts. And that's what Jesus is saying here, because one who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery in his heart. And so that makes him not guilty of physical adultery, but it does make him guilty of sin. Does that make sense? Do you see the distinction that Jesus is making there? And so Jesus says, on that basis, considering the seriousness of sins of the heart, not just sins of the flesh, not just sins of physical activity, but sins of the heart are equally serious, then that means that there are radical steps that might need to be taken. When somebody generally uses the word radical or describes someone as a fanatic or describes someone as fanatical, what do they mean by that?
Crazy?
Crazy? Okay, yeah. Extreme, right? That word those words have been used particularly in the last 20 years, I would say, in the post 9/11 world,
Terrorism.
talking about terrorism, radical Islamists, radical Muslims, fanatical, religious fanaticism, right? And so those words have a very negative connotation in our mind. But look again at what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5. If your right eye offends you, tear it out, throw it from you. If your right hand offends you, cut it off and throw it from you. I don't know a better word to use than to describe that as radical, to describe that as fanatical, to describe that as extreme. And sometimes I think we want to make the teaching here metaphorical. And I think there is a sense in which Jesus is hyperbolizing. Because, if you pluck out your right eye, you still have your left that can just as much lust as the other. And if your right hand causes you to sin, you still have, and you cut it off, you still have the left hand with which you can sin, almost as easily as the other, just depending on whether or not you're right-handed, left-handed, or ambidextrous, right? So in one sense, it's not about the eye or the hand, but Jesus is, hey, Caden, good to see you, buddy. But it is good to think about the extreme that Jesus is calling for, because that's how serious this is. sin requires radical surgery. Maybe not physical amputation, but spiritual amputation. Um, the um, uh, the the King James translation refers to the right eye, the right hand offending. Other translations, the idea of offense here is that they cause to stumble. That is, they are what leads one to sin. Right? And so, if your right eye or your right hand, or for that matter, anything else, causes you to stumble, then it needs to be amputated, because it's better that be amputated from your body than for your entire body to burn in hell. That's pretty extreme language. We don't need to shy away from that. We don't need to try to soften what Jesus is teaching here. We need to be impressed by just how radical that is. So, to move beyond right eye and right hand, what radical surgery, what extreme measures do we need to be willing to take?
I think it would.
Go ahead.
I guess the bottom line would be just to put God first. Get rid of whatever is stopping us from doing His will.
Okay, but I want to get really practical for a moment, and I want to talk about some specific things that might need to be amputated from the life of a Christian. And I realize that that's very personal. I realize that that's different, and what might need to be amputated from my life might not be something that causes another to stumble, and vice versa. I completely get that.
Your friends.
But yeah, there may be some friends that we need to amputate.
Yeah.
TV.
Television. What else can you think of?
Facebook.
Facebook, social media. I was thinking it, Kathy.
A lot of hobbies,
Hobbies.
I mean, there's just a lot of those in male and female specific too, with things that would take our time that we could use better doing something else.
I'll touch the third rail of American culture. Cell phones.
Yeah.
Especially smartphones. Texting. There was a time when phone call worked just fine. And texting has become a vehicle by which a lot of information is shared that, quite frankly, doesn't need to be shared. A vehicle through which a lot of gossip and slander has been accomplished. It may even be members of our own family. Now, I realize that I'm not saying, that husbands can leave wives, or wives leave husbands, or parents abandon children, or children abandon parents. I'm not saying that. I understand there are responsibilities that we must fulfill. But especially when it comes to extended families, and Laura just chimed in, talking about establishing boundaries with our families. There needs to be some of that. There may be people, there may be classmates for those young members of our class who are participating. There may be classmates that we're just going to have to set some healthy boundaries. We may not be able, we're stuck with them in school. They are our classmates. We're going to have classes with them. We're going to have to interact with them on some level. But you know what? We're going to set some boundaries there, because they are not good influences. And so, again, these are the kinds of practical, radical things we need. And I think too often we read through a passage like this where Jesus talks about amputating eye and hand, and we say he's hyperbolizing. And I don't disagree with that on one level. But we are so quick to say that we don't stop to think about the application that we need to make of that principle. of the amputation that needs to happen. I'm going to throw out another one. It may be that we need to amputate some literature from our lives. I will tell you that there are just some things that aren't fit reading for a Christian. Just as there are some things that are not fit watching or listening to. There's some music that needs to be amputated. I think music is a far more powerfully pervasive influence in our lives, because music by its very nature has a way of ingraining in our psyche and our emotion. I think we need to really think about music. Now, I like music, and I like not so much new stuff, but I mean, I like popular music. I like secular music. But we need to think about, excuse me. Well, we need to think about what those messages, what those ideas are that are being that are being ingrained in our minds. Anything else by way of application along those lines? I know I'm getting on a little bit of a soapbox here, but I do think it's an important principle to consider. I just looked at my own screen as I'm taking a drink of water, and the thing looks bigger than my head. So I'm sorry about that. I promise it's the same size bottle of water I always use. Okay. Well, since we've introduced this element talking about particularly sexual morality, I don't want to separate the paragraph we've just read from the paragraph that immediately follows. And so let's talk about this. Kathy, Rich, would you be willing to read for us tonight?
Yes.
If you will read verses 31. Let's just do 31 and 32. Let's talk about that first.
Matthew 5:31. It hath been said, whosoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. But I say unto you, that whosoever shall put away his wife, saving from the cause of fornication, causes her to commit adultery. And whosoever shall marry her that is divorced committeth adultery.
Okay, thank you. So obviously the connection to the preceding verses is obvious. There is the element of adultery that's involved. There is the matter of sexual sin, physical sin between I started to say between man and woman, but fornication is obviously larger than that. But 31 and 32 deals with the matter of divorce. I don't want to turn this study into an extended discussion of God's laws regarding marriage, divorce, and remarriage. I'm not going to shy away from that either. But I want to look as much as we can at what is being said in this passage. And again, understand that Jesus is drawing a contrast. And so it was said, whoever sends away or puts away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. That's what the law says in Deuteronomy chapter 24 on a most basic level. That's what was written in the law of Moses. There was debate about what legitimate cause was allowed in Deuteronomy 24, debate that raged in the first century with Jesus. But what I want you to see is that Jesus says there's something bigger, because just stating that law as this formulaic way, okay, well, if I'm going to put her away, I have to give her a certificate of divorce. That gave her then permission to go and be joined to another. That was the point of the law. But Jesus said that just assumes that putting away can just be done without really for any reason at any cause. Jesus said, but whoever divorces, verse 32, and again, the word there, divorce, is the same phrase, putting away. It's directional. Whoever puts away except for the reason of fornication, except for the cause of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a put away woman commits adultery. And so Jesus elevates the standard here. Regardless of what debate might have been about Deuteronomy 24, Jesus here raises the bar. He doesn't talk about remarriage except in the end of that verse. He doesn't talk about the one who does the putting away and whether or not that person has any right to remarriage. That's a discussion for other passages. But what he does say is that if you put her away and she's a fornicator, then she's already guilty of adultery if she remarries. She's already become a fornicator. She's already become an adulterer. She's already violated that bond. But if she hasn't, if she's not guilty of fornication and you put her away and she remarries, she's guilty of adultery and you're guilty of making her commit adultery. You're party to her sin because that's the position you put her in. The marriage bond, there is a sanctity to the marriage bond that needs to be protected. There is an attitude, a disposition toward that needs to be beyond and above just the matter of, well, I'm ready to move on. Here's a divorce. And now you can move on too. This idea of disposable marriage is not what God ever intended. That's brought out, I think, more vividly in passages like Mark 10 and Matthew 19. But I think that is at the heart of what Jesus is saying here as well. And so, again, without getting into every nuance and application, and that can be done almost indefinitely because of the circumstances into which various people get themselves on the matter of marriage and divorce and remarriage, unfortunately. That can, as we know, become a very extended study. But what I want you to see is that Jesus is elevating the standard of righteousness. That's the section of contrast that we're looking at here, where Jesus is saying a kingdom citizen needs to regard marriage on a higher level than should regard marriage on a higher level than anybody else. They're going to hold marriage to a higher standard. All right. Question, comment, observation, complaint, criticism. Y'all are quiet tonight. All right. I think the next paragraph naturally flows from that. And while it's not about adultery and it's not specifically about marriage, it is about fulfilling vows, and it is about the integrity of our word. And so while Jesus, so you kind of see this flow of thought. He starts with murder and shifts to the content of heart. The content of heart connects to adultery. Adultery connects to marriage. Marriage connects to vows. Do you see how these ideas naturally flow one to the next? So, Vicky, would you be willing to read for us tonight? If you will, please read verses 33 through 36, please.
33. Again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform your oaths to the Lord. But I say to you, do not swear at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by the earth, for it is the footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Nor shall you swear by your head, because you cannot make one hair white or black.
One more.
37.
Yes.
But let your yes be yes, and your no, no, for whatever is more than these is from the evil one.
Okay. So sometimes in discussing this, we get caught up in whether or not it's right to take an oath at all. In other words, can someone swear or affirm something, for example, in a court of law, or take an oath of office, or swear an affidavit for legal purposes, or a disposition, be on record in a legal disposition. I'm not going to get into all of that. Okay. Sometimes we get bogged down in, well, what is this business of making an oath by heaven, or the throne of God, or earth, or Jerusalem, or by our own head? The idea there is that you make an oath by something that's given as surety or as a pledge, right? The idea is somebody says, I'm going to swear on my own life, right? Well, what does that mean? That means that if I'm lying, my life is on the line for what I'm saying, right? Do you follow that? So what Jesus is saying is, you don't swear by heaven, because you can't forfeit heaven as the dwelling place of God. You can't give up heaven if you're being dishonest, or earth, or the city of Jerusalem, or even your own head. I mean, your own life, but the idea of the quality of your hair. You can't affect that. And so rather than feeling the need to go to such extreme measures, again, for the need for hyperbolizing in order to get someone to believe you, your character ought to be such that your yes is yes and your no is no. That your word can be depended upon. And you don't have to swear or affirm or take an oath. The people who know you know that your word yes means yes and your word no means no. And so the same thing happens today. Maybe not so much, sometimes people will use spiritual language in oaths or in swearing. But you'll hear people use extremes, and I'm only using these for illustration. I swear on my mother's grave. You ever heard that? Right? I mean, that's kind of one of those common ones. Well, I shouldn't have to do that. Now, for this, I'm going to inject my personal judgment for legal proceedings, for legality purposes. I may be compelled under law that I need to give an oath or swear an affidavit or something of that nature in a context where my word, my character isn't otherwise established. What Jesus is saying is that under normal circumstances, I believe that kind of extreme ought not be necessary. And so, to tie this backwards to the business of marriage, you made a vow. You made a commitment. Your character needs to be such that you're going to honor that commitment. If it's not, then you're lacking the character of a kingdom citizen. Your righteousness falls far short of what it ought to be. Your yes needs to be yes, and your no needs to be no. Okay. I'm not going to get into another paragraph we've got about 2.5 minutes left tonight. So I am going to stop talking at the moment and give you all a chance to respond either to our immediate context or anything else that we've studied up to this point, either tonight or in the broader context of the sermon. Anything you all would like to share?
James makes the same kind of statement, pretty much quoting what Jesus said about this, that your yea be yea, your nay be nay. Like I say, it shouldn't be the extreme, but I always found it interesting. Apostle Paul used the phrase, before God, I lie not. And he kind of called before God. And it wasn't a flippant thing he was talking about either.
Exactly right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And in those kinds of context, it may be a situation where he's affirming something to a broader audience that may not be acquainted. He's trying to bolster and give confidence to what he's saying. And so I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that. But again, the point is that should not be under normal circumstances. That shouldn't be necessary. Again, we're talking about matters of the heart. All right, anybody else? Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I couldn't remember where the verse was. It talks about making no provision for the flesh when you were talking about applying things we might need to eradicate from our lives.
Oh, yeah, that's a great, I want to say that's in Romans chapter 14. But for whatever reason, I'm not going to be absolutely certain about that. Make no provision for the flesh or the lust thereof, something to that effect. Am I remembering that right?
Yeah.
I may be wrong. It may be Romans 15, or it may not even be in the book of Romans. I'll try to find that and I'll send that out in the text. But yeah, but that's a great thought, Juanita. Yeah, I'm glad you shared that. All right, well, we're going to get kicked off of here in just a minute. So I'm going to say good night. Happy Thanksgiving to everyone. If you're traveling, be safe. Enjoy whatever socially or family distance Thanksgiving or